Welcome to How I Raised It, the podcast that goes behind the scenes with entrepreneurs who've raised capital. We uncover the tips, tricks, and techniques they use to get investors to write a check. Strap in and turn it up.
Hi, welcome to another episode of How I Raised It, produced by foundersuite.com. Today I have Kim Raath of Topple coming to us from Houston. How's your day going?
Great. Thank you. Very sunny today. It's not cold at all.
Yeah. So you're in Houston's kind of good months, right? Because I mean, the summers are brutal. And then, but I guess now's the time to be.
You are absolutely correct. I am very happy to be in Houston everywhere after August to March, April.
Right. But you're originally South African, you mentioned before the call. So how did you go from South Africa to Houston, and why Houston?
Yeah, so it's actually a very cool Topple story, the whole thing. But ultimately, about 10 years ago, I was spending a year working for an organization just after high school in South Africa, traveling around the world where we were implementing and rebuilding communities, or implementing technologies within communities and helping tsunami rebuilding, doing various different things in different areas of the world. And it was during that time, just before that, I was the heptathlon track and field South African champion. And so during that year, I actually got offered a track and field scholarship here in the US, in Arkansas of all places. And so it was just after, so I spent that year working I was in 18 different countries, working on various different projects. We did some mudslide rebuilding in Guatemala. And a lot of there is where I saw a lot of need for digital infrastructure, which we can talk about a little bit later. But yeah, so ultimately came to the US track and field scholarship. And then while I was in Arkansas, I started exploring various different degrees, ended up with a math degree and minors in a lot of different things. So I did my pre-med prereqs, my pre-law prereqs. Being on a scholarship, it was great. I love being educated. So I did some science research during that time, but also some deep tech research. And then when we moved to Houston, my husband's also South African. And so we moved to Houston for his job. I started working for Rice University in their Global Health Institute, and I was the associate for the Beyond Traditional Borders program. What that means is we ultimately took technologies designed at Rice universities, made them more robust and low cost, and implemented them into developing regions. So primarily Malawi is where we were working. And so during that time, I had a lot of questions. And so the founders of Rice 360, which is this Global Health Institute, told me that I needed to go answer these questions myself. So I ended up enrolling in Rice as a statistics PhD, but I joined the Center for Computational Finance and Economic Systems, which is called COFIES, which is inside the stats department, that allowed me to do economics at the same time. Because I was trying to figure out if we're implementing all these technologies within these regions, how are we really making an impact, and how do we track that impact? And so that's kind of how I ended up where I was. And that's my first semester is when I met my co-founders.
Okay, yeah. Well, let's go to Topple then. So what is Topple? It sounds like, continuing with this story, we get to Topple. So
yeah.
What is Topple?
Like I said before, the Topple journey has definitely been something that's come for 10 years for me. And so I met Chris, my now CEO, co-founder, and James, CTO, in 2015. We were at a COFIES blockchain conference. And so I just started my PhD, and I'm now learning more about technologies, especially like technology leapfrogging, a lot of different things. And at that point, Chris and James were busy in Rice's startup accelerator called Owlspark. And they were both—
Called what? Say again?
Owlspark. So with the Rice Owls, So Owlspark actually is a conjoined of Rice Owls and the Red Spark Labs from University of Houston. And so that's the conjoinment of those two words. And so at that point in time, we spent some time talking about the issues I had faced in these regions, where we had goods moving into these regions, funds moving out of these regions. We needed to track various different metrics like clinical outcomes, be it technology development, are these technologies actually working, and how are these technologies making an impact? And so those were the things that were running through my head at the time. But what happened is Chris and James, having built, what they were doing is they were building a platform, a payment platform on the Ethereum blockchain at that time. And they saw two things. One, they saw, a market that didn't really need a payment system on the blockchain necessarily. And the other thing is the difficulty of actually building on top of a new blockchain and how the space is very, very new. Mm-hmm. So we sat down in 2015 and said, okay, well, what if we build a novel blockchain infrastructure specifically to help companies prove and then ultimately monetize sustainable and ethical practices? So changing their impact into an asset. So for instance, what if I can now prove to you, and I can 100% that this diamond, this is my newest edition, is actually...
Congrats.
Thank you. It is this diamond no person died for. And I have tamper-proof evidence that it happened. Or the coffee that I actually have in my cup this morning, no person, no child labored over. And the chocolates that I have in this little bag, which is the company we work with, no child labored over that chocolate, and all the farmers were paid living wages. So what we do at Topple, we help companies like these change their ethical practices and the sustainable certifications that they have by ultimately tracking them in real time and speeding up the process so that it is not as costly of having some random auditor go out to the middle of nowhere to audit maybe 50 out of the 500 farms, and you're never guaranteed 3 years later that that same certification is still happening. So we help these companies. Ultimately, they are changing the world, but they don't really have the ability to prove that they're changing the world. So Topple built this novel infrastructure, and we also launched it last year, that helps these companies change their impact into an asset.
So to sort of see if I can paraphrase, I mean, companies, for-profit companies that have maybe a social benefit angle to their marketing or, their brand, are licensing this from you or paying you a certification fee? Or is it software? Is it more the whole overall certification and proof?
So Topple kind of lives at the infrastructure level. So you can think of like a grid of high-speed rails that is the underlying infrastructure that helps essentially like fill the gaps that were previously damaged by trust. So to make little digital handshakes in areas where you couldn't previously prove certain transactions were happening. And so you can think about it as the grid of high-speed rails being, we take a small toll fee on any of the volume that is moving through the network. So anything you prove or move through the network, there's a 0.25% transaction fee to essentially notarize that transaction. And we exist at the infrastructure level. So every one of these companies, if I go with the grid of high-speed rails, is actually a station that's on top of our rails. And so we have different types of stations. We have companies that are like single stations, and they're a single brand using this to track, like, for instance, the sustainable development goals for this company. They track these 6 sustainable development goals, and ultimately the premium that they leverage from the chocolates they sell, this company sends it back to Colombia. It's called Choco for Peace, to the farmers that they've now helped move over from cocoa to cacao production. So also being able to prove out to the customer on the other side that that money is actually going somewhere, is actually being used, and the impact outcome of that is coming back to the consumer. So you can see that. So they're using it for marketing. But then we have other companies like Fair Food, which we call a central station. And so what I mean by that is Fair Food is a living wage farming certification organization. So they are literally a SaaS platform built on top of Topple. We power them. And what they do is they prove every step of the way of living wage certification for the brands that want the Fair Food stamp on their products. Okay. So we have these central stations and single stations. So it can either be a certification process or a marketing premium that they want to prove out. And it's kind of coming through. It's not just, it pushes through the operational expenses, the marketing costs. A lot of this is pushing through even financing, because what you can also do with this is you can start financing these farmers. You can help them actually have donations. You can send straight back, because if you actually scan this QR code, you can talk to this chocolate and you can give back to this farmer personally in the store. And so those are the types of things we're trying to enable so like a full-on, digital infrastructure that connects all these players.
Yeah. Interesting. It's just about to go over my head. Like, it's right at the point where I don't get it, but I think I get it. So let's take it at that. Pretty interesting. And how many brands or customers do you have, or what's where are you guys at in terms of kind of being in the market? It sounds like a very ambitious and much needed thing. It seems like it would be hard as hell to market and sell this. Where are you guys at?
So what is really cool is James and I are both PhDs. We were PhDs when Chris met us. He was an undergrad at Rice at the point. And so what we decided even before we went out to really build a business around is to build the technology first and see if it's even possible. And so we launched the testnet earlier last year, and then the mainnet, the actual transaction working environment of our blockchain in December, with the first live, we call them elements, so these stations, with that platform from Fair Food. And since then we had 2 more come on, so 2 more literally applications being driven on this network. So I have had this year, we've had about 300K in volume that's moved over the network. And about, we started generating transaction revenue. And what we've seen is a lot of these companies want us to help them build, so onboard, these platforms. And so we've been able to generate about 100K in revenue since March. And we're seeing a lot of traction from that perspective. So yes, we do have multiple platforms, elements in various stages of design now. And so we'll probably see 2 more go live in Q1 and then kind of scale from there. And as I said, these central stations, they're already live. So Fair Food, for instance, they're bringing on 2, 3, 4 more brands. So that's immediate volume that we have not necessarily have to participate with gathering. So it's a more hub and spoke approach where we don't necessarily, we serve Fair Food, they serve their customer. Got
it. Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Awesome. Let's talk about raising money for this. It seems like it would be an interesting one to go pitch to investors. So maybe talk about how much have you guys raised, and how many rounds?
Yeah, so to date we've raised about 1.5 million. In the beginning, what we did is we had some family support just in the start of it all. But when in 2015, when the 3 of us kind of sat together, it took us about 2 years before the 2 of us had this conversation multiple times of actually saying, okay, this is much bigger than we can ever think. We are first-time founders, but no one's doing it. And at that point, James, I call him the voice of reason, was very much saying, well, we should take this on. And Chris, our chief architect, had already started designing everything. And so I got stuck with the role of chief evangelist. And so what happened is around 2017, we actually pitched the idea at the annual conference for the computational finance seminar. And this got picked up by a Dutch incubator, which was literally at the intersection of sustainability and technology. And so we got funding ultimately from the Dutch government. So Chris moved over there while James and I still finished our PhDs. And we got funding from them, and then got picked up by a German venture group. And so we had about, $500,000 funding grant funding from them and from this incubator. But then quickly, Texas found out we left. And so Capital Factory in Austin invited us back to come pitch South by Southwest last year. And so we were in Capital Factory's Accelerator last year. They invited us immediately after the pitch. We got second place. And then at that point in time, it was very much this, blockchain was going down. There was a winter. We were ramping up. A lot of people had literally exactly what we're talking about. A lot of people were claiming that they're using blockchain, but the blockchain that they needed to use for their applications did not exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so we kind of came in with those features and functionalities that these companies really needed. So we drastically picked up in demand, because we literally had companies like IBM, Hyperledger, and those companies marketing for us, because companies already committed to using blockchain. They didn't find the features and functionality they needed there, but because they were already committed, started looking for other blockchains. And so we've seen a lot of conversions for that reason. But at that point, I needed to double my tech team. And so because we had already, like, our core architecture was so good, so I had to come back and say, okay, where are we going to raise these funds? We're hitting at the end of last year, there was a really, like, I call it the crypto winter.
Yeah.
And it was pretty brutal, because I honestly think a lot of the companies that were raising on ideas were very silly ideas. And if anyone with some Econ 101 background could read some of those white papers and see these are not ideas that will come to full fruition. And we saw a lot of that, but there was a lot of money that poured into it. So heavy skepticism at that point.
Yeah, sure.
And so that's when I had to start raising, because I got stuck with the job of chief evangelist.
So talk about that. So talk about raising, I guess, the next million in Houston in the face of a crypto winter. How do you even, brave those storm winds?
So it was about a year ago that this conversation happened, where me, James, Chris were sitting down and saying, okay, Kim, you need to raise. Like, you're the one that can actually convince people that we have the technology, we are further than most people. You need to go tell people and educate people what we've done. And so I said, okay. And so my first wonderful tales for the trenches here is I went and pitched this competition called the Open Houston. Now,
Houston?
Yeah, Open Houston pitch competition. And what it is you had 5 minutes. I had 5 minutes with this crazy company. And I had no slides. And so as technical founders, we have a tendency to go very technical. And I know I've probably gone very technical here already. But I ended up just getting to a point where I was like, I'm just going to tell a story. Right. And so I told the story of what we're doing in Colombia with this group, that it's a group of women, early childhood education. And what they're trying to do is to become independent, and they're educating about 800 kids. So they wanted to raise funding to become a food distribution center. So actually connect like local farmers and local consumers for these children, the families. So it's about 40,000 people, instead of having to go to these cities. And so I told this story about how our technology is enabling these people to essentially, when goods are delivered to these education centers from these farmers, it's tracked from farm to that market. And then the registered family picks up the goods. So it's also tracked, the nutritional outcome and the educational outcome is tracked at that center. And their funding actually ended up coming from the Gates Foundation. And so what we do is essentially create this concept of an impact credit, where you're now able to track nutritional outcomes, educational outcomes, just like you track a carbon credit, which is also another platform that runs on the top of blockchain. And so I told that story about how Como que Vaya, this woman-run organization, was trying to solve this problem of actually showing that they are making an impact. And so I went and sat down, and I was like, oh, this was probably super confusing. And then other people get up and they have slides. I'm like, wait, what? Like, this is terrible. Like, I'm the only person like doing this, and it's the most difficult concept. But ultimately, I actually ended up winning.
Oh, cool.
And so I think it's just because I followed the rules. But that was really intense for me. So I spent about a few months really refining messaging and thinking through storytelling more, and thinking through, the diamond journey, the chocolate journey, the coffee journey. What does that look like? What does that feel like? How are we associated with that? And I mean, some things helped me, like Netflix coming out with the series called Rotten, which is exactly what we do.
Yeah.
So every time someone watches Rotten, they're like, oh, Kim, you guys are perfect for this.
Yeah.
So some of those things help. But what I had to do at that point in time is I realized I need to do two things. I have to educate people on what we're doing. And I also, not just what we're doing, but what blockchain is in general, because they have warped views about blockchain. The second thing was actually trying to take our blockchain mindsets, which is a very different type of investment model, because that time there were these ICOs and everything, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately bring this into a very traditional corporate structure and then talk to traditional investors. And so what I did, I started hosting these education wine nights, essentially. And so one, being affiliated with Rice, and also, being a visiting speaker in the blockchain fintech courses at Rice, and also now officially Topple's teaching the spring undergrad blockchain course at Rice University. And so doing this, we realized, okay, there's an opportunity here. And so I loved, as a statistician, saying, okay, there's multiple networks in Houston. There's a lot of capital in Houston. And so maybe if I just become the intersection of each of these networks, and then it's not about who you know, it's about who knows of you. And then they start talking to each other, and then I could really create that tipping point, right? The contagion that everyone always talks about, but as an excited statistician, I was like, well, this is a great experiment. Let me see if it really works. And I started doing this, and oh my word, I love getting to know all the people, because I spend a lot of time, give back some of my own time, because I come from biotech background, so I spend a lot of time with a lot of these ecosystems, actually just giving back my time and not even talking about what I'm doing. And that sprung to people just making introductions left and right. And ultimately, what happened is one of the venture groups in Houston, which we were too small for, because we were raising only 700K at the moment, and then oversubscribed to $1 million, as you mentioned earlier. But they went ahead and kind of acted as my pseudo lead. So we went through the full diligence process with them and negotiated terms and valuation. And then ultimately, they brought in a lot of their co-investors, which was amazing. Mm-hmm. So this informal syndicate, I would say, made up about half of that round. And so immediately that tipping point started, and everyone was like, wait, if these people are involved, then others want to get involved too. And so what I wanted to try and do, and my team agreed, is I wanted the investors to look like the team, and also look like Houston. So diversity was key, because we are the most diverse city in the US, well, by certain standards, I know. Mm-hmm. But so what we did is I had various different conversations with different groups, and we ended up with, now we have 4 different ethnic groups that have invested. We have more than 10 PhDs that have invested. We have about 40% female in this round. And then, I ended up with 75% of my round Houston funded, because I had to spend a lot of personal time, so a lot of family money, so a lot of family funds, but also strategic in the sense of a lot of these investors have now become potential customers. So that's kind of the big journey, the big story of how everything came together. But
it's interesting. So let's pick it apart a little bit. So you're out there. I like this concept of, kind of putting yourself at the intersection of all these networks. And that's what led to finding this one Houston venture fund. And they led the round. Did they kind of come in and say, we want to lead this round? Or is it more, how did that, talk about that little?
Yeah. So the director that runs it's called the Goose Society of Texas.
Goose?
And so Goose, yes. The Grand Order of Successful Entrepreneurs. Very humble name.
Oh, funny. And this is an angel group or just a networking group?
So they are a super angel group. So they are actually moving towards becoming a full-on venture group, like VC in the near future. Watch out for that, Houston people. They're coming soon. But ultimately, it's 30 entrepreneurs that have successfully exited their own businesses and have come together, and they fund deals together. And so the director who runs this venture group, Samantha Lewis, she and I had met each other through Rice. They are very, very closely related to Rice University. And so she kind of took this mentorship role where me and her spent a lot of time together. And the more she digged into the company, she was like, well, usually the more I dig in, the less I like this more. And so ended up going and doing like a pseudo lead. So actually did the whole diligence because we were too small for the group. This group usually puts $1 million in from the beginning. Mm-hmm. So they don't do rounds even less than $1 million. And so what happened, I ended up having a bunch of the geese or the gander. Ultimately, most of them were male.
Right.
She's also working on that. But a bunch of them actually investing in this round. And so with that, yes, we have a close relationship with Goose, and I think there might be future there too. We'll see. But ultimately, that's kind of what happened. So this document, this diligence document that came out of this, and the term sheets that came out of this is what everyone followed on.
Talk about, and how many investors came in? So was this a pretty large collection of mostly high net worth and angels then that did the round?
Yes. So it was in total, there were 2 syndicates ultimately. This syndicate that made up about $500,000, mm-hmm. and then another syndicate that made up a total of like $150,000, and then a few high net worth families that came in on the rest.
Talk about, okay, so you get Goose Society involved, Samantha Lewis kind of organizing or catalyzing the round, but then talk about bringing in all the other investors. I can only imagine pitching this concept, which I only loosely understand, to a bunch of people who've made their money in oil and gas in Houston. And I'm stereotyping here, but I can see a disconnect there already. Maybe talk about like convincing the other. How many people came in on the round?
Total with the syndicates, it's about 50 people. If you want to, if I count the syndicates people included. Yeah, so ultimately, I think what it was, it's more about explaining the use cases because we are also, a city with all the Fortune 500 companies in this city. There's a lot of logistics. There's a lot of supply chain here. There's people who understand the hiccups that exist in and the pain points that exist in moving something from source to sale, right? And actually proving out that those claims are real. We have HEB here, we have various different things that exist here in Texas that kind of helped in that direction where people were like, well, okay, yes, I fully understand the hiccups because I have actually worked moving something from Indonesia to Houston, or because we also have one of the largest ports, right? So people who understand that how difficult it is for not just the source being in the US, but the source being ultimately in the middle of nowhere, and then moving that information and making sure that you have essentially that digital twin that is tamper-proof. Because ultimately what happens, manipulation happens after the fact. And when that data is recorded while it's moving and you can't go tamper with that data and you can't actually intersect when you're doing these things, it really does make a big difference of where the damage or the trust damage comes in.
It totally makes sense. And that actually connects a lot of dots for me when you're talking to investors who understand logistics, supply chain, then it totally makes sense that they would get what you're doing. Totally little bit of a tangent here. When you're actually in the field, like these women in Colombia, how are they recording a transaction? Because I'm imagining they're not very they don't have wireless tablets out there, do they? Or how are they getting this transaction recorded?
So I'll tell you a little bit about the farmers in Indonesia, which is pretty fascinating. So being from South Africa, right, we actually have pretty good tech in developing countries. But what we do in Colombia is when the farmer delivers their good to the farming cooperative. And when I say we, I mean our partners. We ultimately just exist as a tech partner. Fair Food is the one with the boots on the ground. We do want to learn more about these processes because we're not experts in these supply chains.
Yep.
So the more we learn about the processes, the better we can be from a technology service. But ultimately, this grid of high-speed rails can actually service any one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens with these farmers is when they come to the farming cooperative, the weight that is essentially recorded, and I know we're on video, so it makes it a little bit easier. I could have showed you one of the platforms, but the farmer gets a text message. So when the weight's recorded at that point in time, the system essentially sends an auto-generated text message, just a simple flip phone, SMS, to the farmer. And also the farmer is paid by mobile wallet, and they've always been paid this way. This is not new. It's just cash is not a very safe thing to carry in these countries. And so they get a text message that they have to validate that they delivered X amount of kilograms of good on X day, and that they were paid this wage.
Mm-hmm.
And so only when that two-factor validation, or we call it adversarial design, exists, does that good get a check mark for actually being a living wage. Now, it doesn't mean that good doesn't move forward, but you do now have full transparency as a consumer to see if your good was a living wage good or not. And that's where this comes in a difference. So you actually, so if we had some time, like show you the platform, and you can actually watch that good move from different farmers and every single transaction that farmers had with the farming cooperative. And as it moved forward through quality control all the way to the consumer in the store, where you can scan a little QR code and interact with that good. And that specific supply chain is nutmeg, spices, as we all know. The Dutch are pretty good with their spice roots.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, in the interest of time, let's get back to just rounding out the rest of that round. So, once you've kind of got Samantha and Goose Society involved, how did you fill out the rest of it? Was there any more social hacking involved, or did people just kind of gravitate to you once you've got some terms and diligence in place?
So I would say there's this really cool quote, and I will actually read it because I think this is a really good statement to make. But there's this quote that it's a heavyweight boxer that made this quote. It's, the more intelligent you are, the more you consider what can go wrong. This awareness often leads to inaction. This is why sharp intellect must be married to wicked resolve and indomitable courage to be most effective. Now I say this because that's exactly what it was. Is Chris, James, and I are literally those three things. Indomitable courage is Chris, wicked resolve is me, ultimately, and that sharp intellect is James. So we ultimately had to pull together and say, I will not stop as my wicked resolve inside of me. Mm-hmm. And we truly believe in what we've built. So the more people we talk to, even if they didn't agree, I always wanted to understand why they disagree. And because I don't see no as no, I see it as maybe. And I see it as maybe I didn't do a good job at explaining what this is. So I think that was one of the biggest things, was ultimately moving forward. And the social hacking did lead to networks that I had never met. And now I can say we've actually built a capital moat around us, because the people in our, and you know how sometimes when you have some of the funds, or I would say like more on the hedge fund side, you would look at how much capital you're connected to. I think if we were to build that little diagram for Topple now, how much capital we are potentially connected to now, because a lot of the people that joined are LPs in certain funds, are GPs. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to name names, but it is a reality of, I don't think my next round will be that difficult. However, I do want to get the right valuation on the next round. So because we do truly believe that what we're building is very different and has gotten a lot of traction. But I am very excited because through this journey, I started building a personal relationship with most of these investors. And that was very awesome for me because they've become mentors. They've become people that I can really tell, like, the good, the bad, the ugly about the company. These are people that I have dinner with on weekends. These are people that I went to Thanksgiving with, so it's really become a family. And I think that was very important for us, is we do the same with the team, is that you become part of Topple, you're part of the mission. You are here for life, even if you go and work somewhere else, even if you end up exiting on the round, you know what I mean? And I think that was one of the biggest things for us is being big on, let's create a family that unites behind, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of zebras, but a zebra is a company that has both purpose and profit in mind, so both white and black. And so it was very important for us to have investors that have purpose and profit as their like core, but also have intelligent capital come into this round, sophisticated capital. Some of them even running P funds, for instance. So it was definitely a great experience, but it was really hard. So wicked resolve is necessary.
Wicked resolve. Any any last either tips you or advice you would give other founders in, other female South African founders in Houston, or more broadly, people navigating Houston family office scene, or even blockchain startups? Any other tips or advice you'd like to give, or anything you did wrong that you wish you could do over again?
Well, okay, if there's a female founder that's South African in Houston, you better find me. But I think my biggest thing, and I've been thinking about this a lot, I would say make sure you have co-founders that you really trust and believe in. Because there will be times where you might want to pull each other's hair out, where you might want to pull your own hair out. But it's definitely been my biggest thing, I would say, is my two co-founders are my, like, other than my dad and my husband, these two men are like my biggest champions. And so I feel that is very necessary, is to have co-founders, which one you can share anything with at any time. And I mean, other than having an idea that actually has traction, and that's also a very important thing, is make sure that there's a real need for what you're doing and test it out. People love having you ask them questions. Would you use this? How would you use this? Does it make sense to you? And that's what we saw with our customers, is most of them were, yes, I want to do a transaction-based volume game. I don't want to not know what my price is going to be when I move something because it's based on some kind of crazy computational algorithm. I want it to actually be based on what I'm moving. I'm not an expert in tech. So it's just simple things that we had to like find out as we went through it. And that's the other thing too. You're always going to find out as you go, but that doesn't mean you should not have action. Because that is, I think, we had really good advice once. Me and James, we were in this conversation with a very big fund. And the guy said to us, make sure you get that airplane in the air, even if it means monkey on the wing with duct tape. And a fire extinguisher. That's what he said too.
And a fire extinguisher.
So, because you never know if a thing's really going to work if you don't really have it going. And this has worked for us. It doesn't mean it has to work for everyone. And we're very excited. We're still very young. We're learning every day. We are first-time entrepreneurs. So having all these mentors around us is crucial. But there's also, as a statistician, my advice, there is noise and there's signal.
Sure.
Make sure you find the signal, not the noise needs to be avoided.
And are you part of WeWork Labs there, or?
Yeah. So what is, I'm going to give a plug because we have the best WeWork Labs manager, Carlos Estrada. He is the coolest guy ever and has been super helpful. We had to find a place to live in Houston when I decided we are moving back from Austin to Houston. Sorry, Austin, you are missing out. And because I started actually building a blockchain coursework at Rice, we wanted to hire straight out of Rice and give back to Rice as well. And so I had to start thinking about a house, like a home for us in Houston. And Carlos is the reason we're at WeWork Labs. I think it's really awesome to have labs managers that understand us, understand what we need. I'm looking for 2 new engineers now. We're looking for a front-end developer and a blockchain engineer. Carlos is helping with that as well and pushing it through the WeWork channels. So those are things that really help. And then it's just plugs. I mean, we have funds visiting Houston very often now because Houston is a new hot topic. And it's through WeWork Labs that I get introductions to these funds and have social events with these funds. So that's very awesome. And I would tell people to get a part. Like we were a MassChallenge company. We've been in Capital Factories Accelerator. We were an incubator in the Netherlands. We believe in this ecosystem model. And we believe it also helps manage and mitigate risk for an investor as well as you go through these programs. Because you learn a lot of things about yourself in a very simple fashion. And a low risk environment for them and us. And I think it has grown us a lot, the process of being a part of all these ecosystems.
You've been through a lot already in a few short years. It's impressive. So, all right, if people want to learn more, it's topl.com, topl.co, right?
Co, yes.
Co.
.co, yeah.
Who owns the .com? Someone else?
Yeah, we should not talk about that.
Okay, never mind.
People can go look, but I would recommend going to topl.co.
Co, good. All right, Kim, this is super fun, interesting stuff. It's a lot clearer to me. I was doing the research before the call. I'm like, I don't really understand, but now I understand much better. So
yay!
This is good.
Well, we're still working on that, though. I think messaging will refine. That's the other thing too. Messaging will always refine. I think it's just about being excited about change and being okay to be chiseled at.
Your stories. I mean, I think something you mentioned, like how you spent some time focused on telling stories, the diamond story, the chocolate story. That's how I would think about this if I was going to pitch this and present this, because it's easy to get confused and lost when you're describing what you're doing. But when you tell it in the context of a story, like, cacao beans going all the way into your chocolate bar, into your supermarket, into your hand or your mouth, that makes a lot of sense. So I like those stories. So.
Thank you. Yes. And you've probably heard a lot of stories, so it's good to hear that coming from you.
I always tell founders, I do some pitch deck reviews, and almost always I say, you need more, for example, ... Like almost every pitch deck or pitch I hear, the founders talking about the technology and the company and all this stuff, but you need to have that sort of, for example, a customer ... That makes 1,000 things more clear, right? Like 1,000 light bulbs go off when you do that well. So, awesome. Well, I'm not going to keep any more. topl.co. Kim Raath, thanks so much. We'll catch you after your next round.
Perfect. Sounds good. Have a good day.
Thank you.